What I saw was how Putin is able to drop like a 500-kilo bomb on an 8-story block of flats and just reduce it to nothing.
When the war started, how long did your intelligence and defense people think it was going to last?
It was clear that those of us who believed in Ukraine were going to be proved right. I talked to people who've been fighting in the Donbass. They are very, very tough guys.
There's a strange reluctance to provide Ukraine with the actual weapons it needs to win the war.
I mean, give me a break. How is it conservative? The United States of America has come in and exceeded expectations.
What do you think Europe owe Ukraine now?
Not having Ukraine in NATO meant the worst war in Europe in 80 years.
Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Glory to the heroes.
Yes, Slava, as they say in Ukraine.
And they are heroes.
The Ukrainians
Yes.
are heroic, and the Ukrainian armed forces are heroic, and everybody in Ukraine who has helped to put their lives at risk day in, day out, to rescue people, the emergency service, they're all completely heroic. And they're heroes. But I think the Ukrainian leadership has also been heroic.
And you were just there.
I was there a few weeks ago. Yes.
Tell us what you saw.
I saw some of the suburbs of Kyiv, which I hadn't really looked at before, and I saw the residue of the Russian attacks, and I saw appalling destruction of the
What does
buildings.
a year of war mean for people living there?
It's been a catastrophe, and what I saw was how Putin is able to drop like a 500-kilo bomb on an 8-story block of flats and just reduce it to nothing, with no conscience at all, no understanding of the laws of war or humanity. But he's doing it the whole time, across all of occupied Ukraine and all the bits that he's attacking. And he's torturing, maiming, murdering innocent civilians the whole time.
And we hear about the heroic Ukrainian resistance, but that daily toll, people living without heat, people living without electricity, without water.
Yeah, I'm so worried about Ukraine fatigue. I'm so worried that people don't understand the urgency of helping Ukraine. You know, this thing is not getting any, the suffering is appalling. They're losing many brave young men and women in combat. They're losing civilians. Children are being killed in attacks on innocent centers of population. They need help. They need more equipment. And the faster we give it, the better.
Today, President Zelensky came here to London and asked for planes.
He did. He gave a remarkable speech, and he was very focused on planes. I was very struck by how much emphasis he put on the need for jets, and it's absolutely true. They need a load of stuff to stop the Russian aggression, but also to retake the ground that Russia has occupied. That's the only way to finish this thing off. You have to get
there's a reluctance. There's a strange reluctance to provide Ukraine with the actual weapons it needs to win the war.
But don't forget, there's always been a reluctance. So right back at the beginning, a year ago, more than a year ago now, 18 months ago, I remember when Ben Wallace and I, the UK Defence Secretary, were first considering whether or not to send shoulder-launched anti-tank weaponry, NLAWs. We had the system saying, no, this will be an escalation, it will provoke the Russians. We did it. It was invaluable. The NLAWs, the Javelins, which the US sent, Donald Trump sent, actually were invaluable in allowing the Ukrainians to protect themselves in that battle space that I saw around Kyiv. Then we had an argument about HIMARS, and then an argument about the multiple launch rocket systems.
Right. Battle tanks. They shouldn't have battle tanks.
An argument, correct, and then an argument about battle tanks. And every time we've come to these forks in the road, we've always taken the option of giving the Ukrainians what they need. But we've done it slowly. And my argument would be, let's stop this titration of support. Let's stop these pipette drops of assistance. I'm not saying these are
what they need faster.
We're giving huge amounts of assistance. And I by the way, I really congratulate and thank profoundly the United States of America. I think what America is doing is fantastic. And I think once again, America is the arsenal of democracy.
You were just in the U.S.
And freedom.
You were just in the U.S. as well. And,
I was.
But you must have heard the reluctance, certainly on the Republican side of the aisle, which is odd. Traditionally...
Yes, I want to caveat. I think that needs to be, put in context. I thought that the overwhelming bulk of the Republicans I met were very strong. And indeed, most of the people I spoke to, Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, Kevin McCarthy, a lot of senators, a lot of Congress, they were actually keen to go faster even than Joe Biden is going. So they were outflanking on that side. But you're right, there are some who take a very peculiar view of what is going on, and I really can't explain it. And they somehow have come to identify through a really weird piece of logic Putin with conservatism, or upholding conservative values, and Ukraine as being woke. I mean, give me a break. How is it conservative to set about extinguishing democracy and freedom in an innocent European country? And how's it conservative, by the way, to encourage the persecution of minority Christian groups, for instance, that don't subscribe to the Orthodox faith? There's nothing conservative about anything that Putin is doing. So I don't understand this. You're right to point at this strain of thinking. I don't believe it's prevalent, and the vast majority of the Republicans I met were really solid.
Now, you were in Kyiv in January a year ago as well, correct?
I was in Kyiv in January. It would have been January. No,
January and February.
Yes.
February.
Just in February, yes, that's right. Yes.
At that time, did you think that Putin was going to invade Ukraine?
Well, we had the evidence that he was going to.
But did you believe that was something that would actually happen? So it was a very interesting
situation. Everything we saw. So I thought, reading his crazy manifesto, his weird essay, treatise about Ukraine, I thought that this guy plainly doesn't think Ukraine's a proper country. This is a mad, chauvinistic, imperialistic battle plan. He's going to do something. And so we formed that view in the UK government.
How early did you form that view? Because you were sending anti-tank weapons in January, right?
Yeah, so months before. Right. So we started the process of trying to send the anti-tank weapons way before January, because as I said to you earlier, it was laborious to persuade people that this was the right thing to do even within our own system. Actually, they got there in the middle of January, which was the nick of time.
And so November was the point, right? Somewhere around November 10th, where you would have received warnings that these unusual troop concentrations.
That's right. So we started to get these very, very convincing intelligence reports, and not just from the US intelligence, but from our own intelligence services. And they were saying that 115 battalion tactical groups were massing on the border with Ukraine, and there seemed to be no other purpose but to invade. And when I went there, however, what was interesting was that there was a kind of mood of slight denial in Kyiv itself. And it was only afterwards I understood why that was. I think Volodymyr Zeleński perfectly knew that Putin was massing for an attack. But as a responsible leader who was about to become a war leader, he could not say to his population, we're all about to be attacked by the Russian army.
Why terrify them?
Because they would have stampeded away from those places where resistance was going to be so absolutely vital. And plus there would have been further economic carnage as well.
Those are very hard decisions to make as a leader. You're sitting there and you're thinking, if I tell people what's actually going to happen, they'll run away. If I don't tell them what's going to happen, they're going to be they're going to be in the path of this war machine. Yeah. People will die.
Well, I think it was an appalling situation he found himself in. And so I warned him that what we were seeing in the intelligence, and also, of course, assured him that we would do everything we could to support.
And in those early visits before the war, you formed a bond with him.
Yes, so I'd met him way back, I think a couple of years previously, and he'd come to London, we got on well. you know, he's a very amusing, entertaining guy. He's got a back. He's come out of showbiz, really, but he's an extremely talented guy, and he wants the right things for Ukraine. You know, I think the UK government has always been very supportive of Ukraine, but we've always been concerned about corruption, about the general direction of the country, and Zelensky seemed to have the right ideas. Amusing,
youthful, friendly, but no one saw the person who has emerged as a result of the war.
I think that's right. I think he has a hardness and a toughness and a clarity about what he wants that no one expected. But he's more than risen to the occasion.
When the war started, February 24th, how long did your intelligence and defense people think it was going to last?
So it's on February the 24th, we get the first, I'm woken at 4:30 in the morning, and I have Volodymyr Zeleński on the line, and he tells me that it's, you know, what's happening. They're being attacked from north, east, south. It's an absolute, it's all-out war, he says. Planes are coming in from Belarus, they're bombing all the airports. And at that stage, the military advice that we were getting, and I think that many other countries were getting, was, look, the Ukrainians are probably going to be overwhelmed within a matter of days. But I didn't believe that, because I had been to Ukraine a couple of times, and I'd talked to them, I talked to people who'd been fighting in the Donbass, and I thought they're very brave. I mean, these are very tough guys, right? You know,
it helps to actually go. It helps to actually go to the place.
And so I went to places like there's a pub in Kyiv which is patronized by the veterans of the Donbass conflict, and you know, it's studied. It's got bullets all over the, you know, instead of wallpaper, and it's you know. They are very, very tough guys. Yeah. And you know, 10 million Ukrainians fought in the Second World War, and they saw that saw off the knife.
My family's Ukrainian, and
right.
Well, yeah.
Right. And they took
people forgot in the West.
So what they forgot was, you know, yes, Stalin's armies defeated Hitler, so they thought, you know, when Russia invades, that must be. But what they forgot was that 10 million of Stalin's armies were Ukrainians.
Yeah. And people also forgot, in a more recent context, that the war hadn't begun when Putin launched this invasion. The war had begun in 2014.
That's so right.
And thousands of people had been killed in battle.
14,000. 14, and so that's so right. And Ukraine had already become a very tough, you know, society that was used to suffering and that was very battle hardened. Very battle-hardened. And one of the interesting things, actually, when you go to Ukraine, as I've done several times since the conflict began, since Putin's invasion, is you know, we talk a lot about Western training, and we're going to train them to do. They know about as much about war fighting as anybody in the world now. You know, there's not a lot.
Right.
Yeah. They're very, very brave.
Yep. How did you understand Putin's initial war plan, which resulted in this vast 60-mile long column of tanks being set on fire day after day? But obviously that's not what he intended.
No, but this is a famous disaster, strategic disaster, which what people don't understand is that those columns of tanks, partly it was because the N-laws were shooting them up, and they were being interrupted on their roads and getting into traffic jams. They're running out of fuel and so on. But what they were really Ubers that were going on their way to pick up their passengers, which were the crews for the tanks, which were all going to arrive at the airport at Hostomel. Right. And the trouble, and so it was the battle for Hostomel Airport.
Let's talk about that battle because I'm fascinated by it.
Well, look, I can't tell you, you really need a military expert, but what happened, as I understand it, was that the Russians landed, and then the Ukrainians had been supplied with an awful lot of intelligence about what was going to happen, and they were ready. They shot the Russians up so badly that the Russians had to retreat, then the Russians tried again. And essentially, even though Hostomel Airport was, not very far away from Kyiv itself, they couldn't capture it. And because they couldn't capture the airport, they couldn't bring their tank crews in, and so there was nothing for the tank. So the tanks, there was no point in the tanks even getting to Kyiv because their crews weren't there. So the whole thing was a massive logistical disaster.
And the airport was defended by 500 local guardsmen, mostly with rifles, right, and a few missiles. Like,
I think the story of Hostomel airport is a complex one.
Tell me what.
There are bits and pieces that you'd have to wait.
How much intelligence had they been given?
We don't comment on all that sort of stuff. We don't comment on all that sort of stuff. But
you would say that that they were aided.
The Ukrainians were fantastically brave, and the basic difference is that the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are fighting for hearth and home. They're fighting for their country. They're fighting for their families. What are Putin's troops fighting? They don't even know why they're fighting. They're poor, terrified conscripts or jailbirds.
For a victory parade they were promised and it never happened.
Correct. Remember what Robert S. McNamara says after the end of the Vietnam War. He says, we weren't fighting communism, we were fighting nationalism. And the truth is that Putin has actually created and intensified the most passionate national feeling anywhere in Europe. And that is going to be an absolutely unbudgeable, unbreakable force.
Right. Whatever arguments one might have had about the existence of a separate Ukrainian nation before the war, Putin certainly will never be those arguments again.
If Putin set out to prove himself wrong, he could not have done so in a more decisive and elegant way. It's over, that argument.
Now, you visited Kiev in April. And I remember the shots of those eerily empty streets with you and Zelensky walking together and one or two or three other humans visible somewhere.
Yeah. No, it was a bit spooky because Volodymyr Zelensky hadn't been out of his bunker for about 6 weeks, as I understood things, and he certainly hadn't done a walkabout like that. I mean, he'd been around, but he hadn't done a thing where you walk around the streets and meet people. And you're right, there weren't that many people around because it was still pretty unclear.
Who in their right mind would let the Prime Minister of Britain go running loose in Kiev with Vladimir Putin's assassins everywhere?
But it was
kind of nuts. How did you?
No, I don't think so. I think that the Ukrainians had done an amazing job. I think they'd cleared the Russians out of Kyiv, and there might have been a few stay behind Russians somewhere in Kyiv, but or Chechens or whatever. But the chances.
Why did you feel that it was important for you to go there then?
This was April. I tell you why. It was because there was a sort of conversation building that there might be a deal. Do you remember all this stuff going on in Belarus, and there was
You've put up a brave fight for 6 weeks. That's wonderful. We all know you're going to lose eventually. Let's end this.
There was a bit of that. There was a bit of that, and everybody was going off to see Putin and just trying to see what conversation there could be. And of course, I couldn't see the logic of any of that because there was no deal you could do with Putin, even if you could persuade the Ukrainians to do a land for peace deal, whatever, give Putin some of the stuff he'd conquered already in exchange, be Mariupol, whatever, and then he retires from the rest. Even if you did that, which would be morally obnoxious, catastrophic, you couldn't rely on him to observe the agreement you'd reached. Because he's shown by his actions in 2014 and since 2014 that he's prepared to do it again and again and again.
How intense was that pressure?
I don't know. I don't think that Zelensky came anywhere near to doing. I don't think to doing a bad deal for Ukraine. But I certainly think there was a lot of chatter in the West about it. And my purpose really was to tell him that whatever, that he would have the UK's unwavering support. And the position that we took from day one, literally from day one, was Putin must fail and Ukraine must succeed, or Ukraine must win.
Now, one of the things that is very, very interesting to me, coming from an American perspective, not only was your leadership wonderful and instrumental, but you were joined, this was a consensus across the parties in the political system in Britain.
Yeah.
There really was support for Ukraine on the left, there was support on the right. If there was criticism of you, people would find some criticism that, oh, the weapons aren't reaching there fast enough.
Absolutely.
Right? It was not a question of why are we involved, why are we spending money, who cares about these people? What accounts for that?
It's a really good question. I think that the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK is interesting on this. It just something about what happened in Ukraine really struck a chord with the British people, and in some deep emotional way, we sympathized with the Ukrainians in their struggle and in their suffering. And I think it's as simple as that. People just opened their hearts to Ukraine.
And was it also the fact that Ukrainians were defending themselves? It was not, come rescue us. It was, help us.
I think that's right. And I think the crucial thing about the way it all unfolded was that in those first few days, it was clear that those of us who'd believed in Ukraine, who'd believed they would fight, were going to be proved right. And that became a virtuous, self-reinforcing phenomenon, because the more they resisted, the more on Capitol Hill there was support for Ukraine. That was the crucial thing. I repeat, it's that huge support that's come from the United States of America.
Can we move the American monster, the Pentagon, the rest of it, and tilt it a little further?
Every time the US has been tested in its resolve on this, there's always been a delay, but in the end, the United States of America has come in and exceeded expectations. So look, I'm just confident that America will continue to help and do the right thing.
Another thing that interests me politically about this, I saw a quote the other day from John Major, and he said that, well, Brexit is a disaster because if someday we really need to take a tough stand on something like China, then we'll be alone and we won't be able to do anything. Whereas if we were in the EU, right? Except this proves the opposite, doesn't it?
Complete nonsense. Exactly, because if we'd been locked in the EU system, with the common foreign policy, with all the discussions, that we would have been locked into subservience to the Normandy process, you remember, which was set up after 2014. It was basically when Britain subcontracted Ukrainian policy to France and Germany. Remember?
Yeah.
And we said, let them get on with it, and we weren't even at the table. I mean,
Brexit, in a real way, made British leadership on this issue possible.
It made it possible. And I think the interesting thing is that certainly in a lot of the East European countries, Central European countries, the Baltic, they totally agree with that. They saw the difference. And I don't think you'd find Emmanuel will necessarily support that, but then he doesn't like Brexit. When we took it, and as I say, the French, at least initially, or before the war broke out, had a different perspective on things. I think, France and Germany did believe, or must have believed, in this Normandy nonsense, and it just didn't work.
Ukraine has purchased its freedom, its nationhood, its place in Europe in blood. No one can deny that. That's what's happened over the last year. They fought, they died, right? They held off this tyrant and this military machine. What do you think Europe and England and NATO owe Ukraine now? What do we have to do?
The Ukrainians are fighting for all of us. The Ukrainians are fighting for the Poles, for the Georgians, for the Moldovans, for the Balts. They're fighting for every country that could have its borders could change by force anywhere in the world. It's a massive sacrifice that they're making. And I think that they're also showing why Putin was wrong. They're showing that they have a Western and a European vocation, that they're a free, democratic, independent nation. And they deserve, I think, once this thing is done, they deserve to be treated with immense respect. And clearly, I think that their membership of the EU, if that is what they choose, should be accelerated by the EU members. Clearly, it's no longer for the UK to have a role in that. But certainly, when it comes to NATO, I think we're now in a very interesting position.
Yeah.
Because if you'd asked me before the war, before Putin did his act of lunacy, is Ukraine going to join NATO anytime soon? I'd have said, I doubt it.
Well, Vladimir Putin asked you that question, right?
He did. And I said, no, not anytime soon. And the reality was, to be frank, there was a strong enough caucus within NATO to block Ukraine that it wouldn't have happened until the Greek calends, or hell freezes over. So, but now, Putin has utterly destroyed the case against Ukrainian membership of NATO. Not having Ukraine in NATO meant the worst war in Europe in 80 years, colossal suffering, global economic disaster. The logic is to get clarity and stability, and whatever, Moscow has forfeited all right to protest now. NATO is not a hostile alliance, NATO is a defensive alliance, and Putin, by his actions, has proved to the Swedes, to the Finns, that NATO is essential for them, and he certainly proved that it's essential for Ukraine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.